and also for the purposes of the recording. Okay, so I'm very pleased to introduce the first speaker. Lisa Bortolotti is a professor of philosophy at the University of Birmingham and one of the co-Is on the Epistemic Injustice project. And Lisa will be speaking to us about epistemic injustice and inhibitors to uptake in the context of mental health. And I'm just going to get her presentation up and running now. So, great. So you should now see Lisa's presentation, and over to Lisa.
Thank you very much, Sheila, for the invitation, and apologies for those who have heard this talk before. But the idea of the talk is really to try and think about how the notion of epistemic injustice is useful. And one thought I want to try and defend today is that it can help us think about the uptake of expertise, and in particular, how expertise can be obstructed. These, I think, will apply to all forms of expertise, but it is especially useful when it comes to thinking about expertise by experience. So just an introduction that almost nobody here needs, but this is part of the EPIC project, which is Epistemic Injustice in Healthcare. And it's looking at ways in which we can think about the application of the notion of epistemic injustice throughout different conditions, and that include mental health and other somatic disease, but also conditions that have to do with loneliness. Some of the examples of this talk will also be taken from the agency project, which was a series of 2 projects that were funded by UKRI, and they looked at agency in mental health and the role of expertise in trying to work on projects together with people who have lived experience and sharing different forms of expertise in order to make progress with questions about how to support young people who are experiencing a mental health crisis. So the plan is to look at what the performance of expertise is and why agency matters in that context, and then to think about different obstacles that can be made to agents performing as experts. And finally, looking at whether the application of the notion of epistemic injustice, the epistemic injustice literature to this context, can help us identify ways in which we obstruct expertise, often without even realizing that that's what we are doing. So starting from an account of expertise, so even just very simple dictionary definitions of expertise tend to identify the first criterion for expertise with high level of skill or knowledge or experience in a given field that is attained by training or practice and can be put to use when we're forming a judgment, doing research, making a decision, or solving a problem. And this is important because to some extent, what the expert is someone who is providing evidence for our making a decision, for instance, when we want our decision to be well informed, or our deciding what to do next when there is a problem that we want to solve. But there is another important criterion that we normally think about when we think about expertise, and kind of philosophical accounts of expertise have picked up on that. It's not just having the knowledge, it's knowing how to use it. So Michael Larkin, who has worked on this notion of expertise with me, talks about it as a meta-knowledge. So a knowledge of how to use the knowledge, skill, of experience in a given domain. And the way he puts it is that you gain familiarity with a particular set of problems. So when you are an expert, you have some knowledge that is relevant to a certain domain, and you know how to apply that knowledge in order to solve problems. But if we think about expertise only in terms of those 2 criteria, there is something that we are missing, and that is where I'm going with the talk. So expert agents provide evidence that is required for others to form a judgment, make an informed decision, or better understand or solve a problem. providing this evidence is a form of performance. And that is the aspect that I think sometimes is neglected. So you can be an expert, but you can serve as an expert or act as an expert only if certain conditions apply. Otherwise, your expertise doesn't get to be utilized. So the performance of expertise is, of course, something that cannot happen unless you've got those two conditions, the knowledge and the meta-knowledge, but also requires a certain environmental situation, where a contextual situation where people give you space to provide your evidence. And when you provide your evidence, they listen to it and take it seriously. So the performance of expertise has to do with the relationship between the individual and the environment. It's not just something that has to do with the intrinsic features of the person who is an expert. So expertise is performed in an environment where it serves some purpose and benefits someone. So it's some kind of social service that people provide, social contribution. And of course, there is space for it if that type of contribution coming from that particular disciplinary context or that particular experience is sought after and valued. Where that kind of knowledge is not sought after and valued, when it's not thought to be the type of evidence that people need in order to make informed decisions, then there is no room for the performance of expertise. So another way of saying this is that the performance of expertise can be either enabled or obstructed by the environment that surrounds the agent, independent of the source of the expertise. So this happens to people who have expertise by, for instance, technical knowledge, by education, but also people who have expertise by training and by experience. There is a sense in which when we think about expertise as a performance, expertise is something that depends on different perspectives. So it's perspectival. It responds to a need. We have already seen that. It's a social contribution that happens only if it is valued. It is influenced by the interests, values, and biases of the agent who provides the expertise, and it bears on the relevant issues through a process of negotiation. So providing the evidence doesn't mean that people just accept the evidence as it is and start believing what the expert has said. There needs to be some sort of negotiation, especially in group decision-making, group problem solving, which might take different shapes. It could be a dialogical process, a consultation, or something that happens by consensus. And here is an example to show that actually the performance of expertise matters even in the more traditional forms of expertise. So this is an example by Michael Larkin. Imagine like an academic during office hours. That's the best possible situation to perform academic expertise. You've got a familiar environment that by its very nature gives you authority because that's your office and students come to ask you questions. You've got all your books on the shelves behind you if you need to remind yourself of anything. You've got internet at your fingertips. And even more important, you know that the people who will come to ask you the questions will use your language and will expect the kind of knowledge that you can provide because they are the students sitting in your class and you have taught them how to talk about certain issues, and you can just clarify what you have explained to them during the class, and that is what is expected of you. But the same academic may feel a lot less comfortable in sharing their expertise, performing their expertise in an unfamiliar context. So my favorite personal example is the hairdresser, but also the taxi driver, right? So what do? I'm a philosopher. Oh, fantastic. What's the meaning of life then? So what happens is that you are caught off guard because it's not the kind of question you'd expect. You're not the kind of question you've been trained to answer, you normally answer. It is addressed by someone who doesn't necessarily share your language. So when you're providing an answer, you also need to think about the kind of concepts that you're going to use and the references that you're going to make. And there is very little background knowledge that can be assumed. So it's a situation where you might find yourself uncomfortable. And there is, of course, a middle ground. Think about a conference, maybe an interdisciplinary conference where you present your paper, you've got people from other disciplines asking you questions. Sometimes you can get the unusual, unexpected question there. Similarly, when we think about expertise by experience, the same conditions apply. So when you are a young person with lived experience of a mental health crisis and mental health services, who is participating in a project investigating healthcare, there are situations in which you can be comfortable in sharing your expertise. For instance, if you're in a group of equals, if they are people that have earned your trust, when you feel safe, you feel supported, you know that if at a certain moment you need a break or you need people to repeat something in a different way, they will do it for you. They're there to support you. There is a structure that allows you to feel comfortable. But you may feel a lot less comfortable in sharing your experiential knowledge if you're made to feel inadequate or inferior, maybe because when you say something, other people around the table look at you in a strange way or challenge what you're saying. If you are put on the spot, so if people ask you very direct questions, maybe about your personal experience that you are not happy to share, if you feel judged, or if you are constrained in your participation. For instance, people ask you to comment only on situations that have to do with the condition that you have experience of, or whether people ask you only to contribute your story, but they're not interested in your opinion about other experts' contribution to the problem, to the research project. So there are different things that can go wrong when the capacity to provide expertise is obstructed. And I'm going to divide them into 3 stages just for convenience. First of all, there may be a situation where you are not thought to be the right kind of person to provide expertise, to be an expert. So at that point, you are not even invited at the table. You don't have a voice at all. The second stage is, yes, you're thought to be someone with relevant knowledge, and your relevant knowledge is valued in this particular occasion, but there are ways in which the discussion goes that end up excluding your perspective or forcing you to offer a perspective in a way that is not the way you'd have offered it otherwise. And third, you're allowed to be there, you're allowed to contribute, so you have space to talk about what you want to talk about, but whenever you make a contribution, this is undermined or challenged without giving yourself time to explain what you meant, or without other people around the table showing curiosity and interest for what you were trying to say. So those are 3 stages of engagement. My favorite example is thinking about a party. One of your friends is giving a party. So there are 3 ways in which you can be excluded from the party. You may not get an invitation at all. You may get an invitation, but when you arrive there, everybody else is in fancy dress, you are not. Nobody is talking to you. There are lots of games you're not invited to participate. So it's as if you weren't there. Or you can, you are part of the party, you are there, you participate in the games, but whenever you do something, people criticize it, or there is absolutely no uptake. People don't listen to you, don't listen to your suggestions about what music to play, or whatever. So these are the 3 different stages of engagement, and I think they can be characterized as forms of epistemic injustice, as epistemic injustice has been studied in the literature by reference to misogyny, racism, and other forms of discrimination. So in terms of the first stage, not being invited, not other people thinking that you don't have much to contribute, you're not actually an expert. An example could be participatory injustice, which is a concept developed by Hookway, with this wonderful example of the philosophy class. So the lecturer talks about an argument, and one of the students in the class raises his hand and asks a question. Now, the question is supposed to be an objection to the argument. But given that the student belongs to a minority group against which the lecturer has some kind of negative stereotype, the lecturer doesn't believe the student to be able to provide an objection to the argument and interprets the question as a question of clarification. Now, of course, the student is not strictly speaking silenced because they get to ask their question. But what happens is that the question is not taken in the same spirit in which it was asked. And as a result, also the quality of the discussion in the classroom, I think, drops, because instead of dealing with an interesting objection, what people have to do is to listen to the lecturer saying something that everybody already knows. Another case is exclusion or harmful inclusion. So a person belonging to a marginalized group may be excluded from epistemic projects or asked to contribute in a way that requires excessive epistemic labor or does not enable them to voice their concern. So this is an example by Polhaus, and the reference is to situations where, for instance, people want to make, let's say, philosophy departments more friendly to women, so they ask the only woman in the department to provide a lot of evidence that she's been discriminated against. And maybe every time she talks about microaggression, people reply, oh, but that's not really bad. You know, that they didn't mean anything wrong there. And the thought is that there is all this incredible labor to prove that something is a problem. But then when the evidence is provided, it's not taken to be evidence because it doesn't match the criteria for evidence that people in the department expect. And as a result, the inclusion policy of the department does not improve. Another possibility, and this we are in the third stage, the stage of uptake, is that the agent contribution is made, so there is space for the expert to provide, to offer the kind of knowledge that they have, but it's taken on board only if it fits prior expectations, and it is reconstrued or challenged if it does not, where very often the prior expectations are the assumptions of the dominant group, right? So a classic example is the Salem witch trials and witch trials in general. So the woman says, I'm not sleeping with the devil, I'm not a witch. They don't believe her. But then after torture, when she says, yes, actually, I'm plotting with the devil to destroy the town, then she is believed, right? So she is believed only when the testimony is extracted, extorted, is offered in a way that undermines the agency of the person who provides the testimony. Another clear case are false confessions, right? Very common, for instance, in the US, cases where, maybe young people of color are accused of rape. Initially, they say, no, we weren't even there at the time. But after being pressurized for an entire evening, they end up admitting to the crime. And when clearly they hadn't committed it. So the idea is, if you just tell me what you have to tell me, I don't believe it. But once I undermine your agency by putting you under pressure or forcing you, then I take what you say as something that reflects the truth. So those are the types of epistemic injustice that occur in the literature that I think, there are lots more, but that can be mapped onto ways of obstructing expertise. And now I'm going to try and show you that those three concepts map onto ways of obstructing expertise when the expertise we are interested in is lived experience. So the expertise of people who have, for instance, experienced a mental health crisis or experienced mental health services and want to provide evidence for research projects or simply want to provide evidence about their own state of health. So the first stage is when, you are supposed to have the knowledge, but people do not recognize it as valuable knowledge for the purposes of their epistemic project. So in hostile environments, an agent's potential to contribute is not recognized because their capacity to acquire the relevant knowledge and familiarity with the problem is challenged or undermined. And one example is offered by Sherif Tekin, for instance. She discusses the role of patient groups in the latest revisions of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So at the time, there was a lot of political pressure for these consultations to include patient groups and the experience of people who actually had a psychiatric diagnosis. And the DSM executive considered this, but then they published a reply by saying that doing so would go against their own objectives because patient experience can only be subjective data, and such data are not valuable, are not what is required when diagnostic criteria are revised. So in this way, the thought was the kind of knowledge that we need is not the kind of knowledge that you can provide. So you are not going to be included in conversations about how to revise the DSM. Another example would be the tokenistic use of expertise by experience in research and policy. So involvement very often is minimal and limited to consultancy when you've got experts by experience joining a panel that makes decisions, like for instance, in a committee that has to decide whether a certain research project meets the ethical guidelines. The thought is that whenever there is a question that has to do with the possible implication of a policy on a group of patients who have the same condition as you comes up, then you are asked what you think about the potential implications, but your voice is not heard in other contexts. You are not given space to speak. You are not put in an environment where you feel comfortable to actually comment on the all kind of maybe the research questions that are making up the project or the methodology of the project. So your role is very limited to just consulting on potential implications. And this is just an example of tokenistic use. In this context, agents do not feel like they're full members of the team. They feel that they have a very specific role to fulfill, very instrumental to what other people are doing, and they don't get to kind of contribute to the agenda of those meetings. They're just an accessory. It's kind of a tick boxing exercise. Then we come to the second stage when we are thinking about the fact that people are given a seat at the table, are made to contribute, but then there are ways in which their contribution is excluded. So in hostile environments, an agent's capacity to contribute may be recognized. So they've got the relevant knowledge this time, but either the agent is not given an opportunity to contribute in the way in which they would like to contribute, or their contributions are deprioritized. So there are other contributions that become more important than the contribution of the agent. So if you've got something to discuss in a very big group and you've got limited time, even just not giving people a turn to speak means that actually they may be left out of the conversation. And that's what I mean when I'm thinking about environmental and contextual situations. So an interesting case is brought up by Angela Woods, who has studied recovery narratives and has noticed how the recovery narratives that are used, for instance, when people want to inspire others to not to feel that their psychiatric diagnosis is a condemnation for life, are always structured in a particular way, which makes us think that when people talk about the mental health issues in a different way, maybe not characterized by insight and inspirations, which are the feature that she finds, then they don't get to be heard, they don't get to be published. So one of that example is the first person accounts of schizophrenia in the Schizophrenia Bulletin, which if you have read some cases of those, always have the same structure. You know, I was very bad, I found a way to get better, now I'm much better. Or other types of recovery narratives that are used, for instance, during mental health campaigns. And what happens is, what if the person doesn't recognize what happened to them, their crisis, as a mental health problem? Or what if the person doesn't think they've actually recovered, or they actually solved the problem they have? We don't seem to see as many of those narratives, which makes Angela Woods think, and their collaborators, that actually only certain types of narratives that fit a certain type of medical model of the first person narrative get to be listened to, and the other ones are excluded, which gives a somehow one-sided representation of what it is to live with a mental health condition. And finally, there is the problem of uptake. So you get a seat at the table, you get to speak, and still the performance of your expertise can be obstructed. In hostile environments, an agent may be recognized the potential to contribute and may even encouraged to contribute, but then their testimony is challenged or reconstrued prior to validation or genuine uptake. So in my view, epistemic injustice is not about who we believe. The idea is not that we need to believe everybody who is speaking. The idea is that we need to engage with everybody who is speaking, right? So we have to give them the opportunity to say what they think is the right thing to say, listen to their testimony, assess it before we decide that needs to be dismissed, right? Or that it needs to be taken up. And I think what happens in these cases is that the challenge of the reconstruction happens before there is an opportunity for actual engagement. So this happens when the agent is even reporting their own feelings, thoughts, or experiences, which is normally an area where we think that people are experts, right? At least they're experts about what they feel or how, what they think about. and where authority and credibility are assumed. So I'm just going to give you the final example, and then I'll stop. So these are the case of Sasha that we looked at during the agency project. It's a young woman accessing mental health emergency services for suicidal thoughts and self-harm. And there are worsening symptoms of OCD. She has a previous diagnosis of obsessive and compulsive disorder, but she's really concerned about a rapid weight loss. And the way we looked at these cases, there are video recorded interactions between healthcare practitioners and emergency services and young people. We cannot show the videos when we are online, but we can look at the transcripts, and this is just a small bit of the transcript. My obsessive behaviors have been getting worse and worse as well. They've now kind of spread into areas of my life, like eating. Yeah, Steve said that he was really concerned about the weight that I've lost so rapidly, and I can feel my heart slowing down, and I can feel the physical symptoms from it. And in terms of your understanding, what's your diagnosis, Sasha? OCD and anxiety, I think. Okay. And that for you, that makes sense, does it? Yes, the only thing that doesn't make sense is why I'm feeling unable to eat and restricting what I'm eating. Okay. Having a kind of unpleasant thoughts about my body shape. Okay. All right. Okay. And I assume that you're really trying eating, and you are, trying to give yourself permission to, enjoy food, whatever. Because I guess you're quite slim and you're worried about losing more weight. Now is not the time to start thinking, well, I shouldn't have any custard, or I shouldn't have any. So you're trying. Are you trying to just have what you fancy when you could eat it? Again, it's easier said than done, but whatever it is, it's not letting me. It's not what, sorry? It's not letting me. Right. Okay. Like I haven't eaten anything today. And I've barely eaten anything since Monday. Just, okay. Yeah, it's got out of control. Okay. So when you do conversation analysis, you look at what people say to each other, but you also look at the nonverbal cues, how people relate to each other, whether they're looking at each other or not, whether they're leaning towards each other or not, and also the pauses. And what you can see, maybe because I gave you some kind of circles to highlight that, is that the practitioner gave very little engagement to Sasha when she was talking about her worries about food, and that Sasha started shutting down when she realized that the healthcare practitioner was not concerned about the food intake. The most important thing is that the young person talks about her eating problem as something that she cannot control. It's not letting me, it's out of control. Whereas the practitioner talks about it as something that can be feasibly managed. Have a bit of cream, if you fancy, without additional interventions. And this is actually reflected in what happens at the end of the consultation, where the only support that Sasha is offered has to do with OCD medication, and not with the fact that she might need help with potential eating disorder. So Sasha refers to eating as something that she cannot do. The practitioner suggests that it is in Sasha's power to eat more, and no particular intervention is needed. And it will be sufficient for Sasha to ask someone to sit with her at mealtime, the practitioner says. So whereas Sasha would like to get specialist support with her eating, for the practitioner, self-help and support from friends and family are sufficient at this stage. 3 months later, because people were video recorded, were also interviewed immediately after the consultation and 3 months afterwards, Sasha was firmly within the anorexic range and got help only because her parents got private healthcare. So they got an eating disorder specialist to look at her. So of course, you cannot predict what the situation will be in 3 months' time. So the healthcare practitioner certainly is not guilty of not having done her job. But what is interesting is that even when Sasha was talking about how she was feeling, her account was challenged and reconstrued as something different. There was no validation of how she felt her eating disorder was affecting her life. So when the agent offers a characterization of their experiences, this can be ignored, or simply there can be a dismissing attitude, maybe making no response, avoiding eye contact, or continuing to write notes without showing any curiosity or interest in what the person is saying. When asked why the university counselor recommended emergency services, for instance, a young person said at some point, "I think they thought it would be good for me to speak to someone who knew what they were about." And the practitioner reconstrued this as, "Oh, so they felt they did not have enough training to reassure you," which clearly is a way to kind of undermine the concern that the person has. They legitimize, that's the word we use, the concern that the young person comes to the emergency services with. And similarly, other ways of doing this, which are very appropriate in the legal context, is this kind of forensic questioning, where it is implied that the young person is being inconsistent in the way they're describing their experiences. So why did you take an overdose? Because I wanted to kill myself. Kill yourself? But then I hear that you called the ambulance straight away. So this idea that, oh, really, your intention must have been different from what you're saying. Another obstructive practices when people talk about their own experiences is proposing alternative characterizations. So when the person says that they feel miserable, a reply was, "Yet in your face when you're speaking, you got a variation of your expression. You smile and things like that. So clearly you have time when you're not miserable." So this idea of kind of not letting the person even describe their own feelings the way they feel at that moment. Okay, I will not continue because we need to close. I need to close. But just in conclusion, what can we do to avoid obstructing expertise? Basically, the opposite of what we have just seen. So recognizing the agent's potential to contribute, creating an opportunity for the agent to contribute, and offering uptake to the agent's contribution. None of this implies believing what the expert is saying. You can still disagree at the end of the process, but you have offered engagement in this case. So engagement supports the performance of expertise in any case of expertise, wherever the expertise comes from. So the framework of epistemic injustice makes salient the multiple ways in which an agent can fail to perform as an expert due to barriers in their environment. And we can use strategies to implement or restore epistemic justice as a guide to develop better practices in collaborative epistemic projects, featuring experts whose knowledge comes from different sources. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Lisa. I am going to pause the recording while we are doing questions in the room because it's not going to be picked up. And if you have any questions in the chat online, please do type them in the chat.